Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be in the world. For all the attendees, good afternoon, I think, to all of the panelists. It's wonderful to see you all again. I think I know every one of you fairly well, but I don't think all of our attendees know you. So if you could do me the great big favor of introducing yourselves, and then I'll throw mine in the end there. Let's start with Robert, and then we'll go to Jeff, and then Greg.
Great. Thanks, Aaron. Yes, my name is Robert Kehoe. I am the CTO here in SmartTech 247, so help drive the product development and kind of technology side of SmartTech.
Awesome. My name is Jeffrey Bell. I'm a principal information security engineer at a pharmaceutical intelligence company called Norstella. And yeah, I'm super excited to be here today.
Hi, everyone. My name's Greg Ainslie. I'm field CTO at Splunk. My background's all data science and analytics, so really looking forward to the opportunity to talk about AI again today.
It's not an unpopular topic, is it?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it comes up a great deal. Okay. My name is Aaron Smith. I am the director of the Information Security Consulting Group here at SmartTech, and I will be acting as the host today. Unfortunately, my job does not sound as cool as biopharmaceutical intelligence. That sounds incredibly cool, but that's fantastic. That sounds like something that VOD has. All right. I'd like to get started. I've got a number of questions that I think are pretty interestingly complex. I'm going to ask them to one person, but I don't expect that conversation to stay that way, right? I'd like to have each of you chime in and sort of comment on what you think and respond to the other person. I'm going to start. I'm just going to kind of go circularly on my monitor here. So let's start with Robert. Robert, what do you see as the things that are emerging as the most prevalent AI changes that are affecting the way that defenders protect their organization? How are we really seeing AI be used by defenders?
Yeah, it's a great question because I guess like if you were to ask that question of any product owner, in any organization in the world, especially in cyber defense, how are they protecting themselves? Absolutely, every single one of them would say there is like AI, AI, AI. There cannot be enough references to AI in everyone's product roadmap at the moment. But like very concretely, I guess, it's been an interesting journey, if you know what I mean, of like this AI effectively once OpenAI kind of like released ChatGPT, everybody was just like, wow, and every year they make predictions. Okay, hey, this is the year of AI. Okay, no, this is the year of agentic AI, and it's never quite right. Kind of people are still struggling a little bit with actually taking it into use. There are like very isolated use cases where it's spectacular and like super impressive. But then trying to embed it in this entire workflow, this is still a challenge for many people, for many organizations. And it's actually something we see very much on the bad guys, that they struggle with this exact same problem, that they are using it very much for the things you would imagine of like, hey, create a phishing email, reword this email in a good format, but they aren't doing this as of yet, this kind of like end to end of, okay, go find 50,000 email addresses that I can spam. Okay, now write an email. Now send that email. Okay, now log in with the credentials from those attacks. So we aren't seeing that kind of like end to end, and it's not surprising because like as awesome as AI is, kind of like the infrastructure is still not there. Maybe agentic AI will solve a lot of these problems of like connecting the dots, if you know what I mean. At the moment, AI use cases are very specific, I would say. But yeah, it's a very interesting time, definitely.
Jeff, what's your take on that? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think that's a very good summary, Robert. I use it a lot for research, whether it be kind of some kind of emerging technique. Obviously, I think security is really interesting because as a defender, you're required to understand or at least be conversational in whether it be cloud, on-prem, email, different databases, all of this kind of stuff. And at the same time, you also need to know how to protect it, right? So kind of wearing those two hats can be very difficult. And that's where I get a lot of benefit from different large language models, ChatGPT, whatever kind of your model of choice is. It's just kind of querying, just having that conversation. Hey, I'm bringing to the table my knowledge and expertise on this kind of thing. How does it relate here? And that's kind of how I structure my kind of learning sessions, trying to understand, okay, what does this database do? Okay, how would someone be able to access it? And just kind of doing that kind of back and forth. I think the research component is incredible. Another kind, and I'm trying to kind of give examples that aren't like your cookie cutter, like I used it to analyze an email header, which is awesome. It definitely can do that stuff as well, so long as you redact the sensitive details, of course. But also like documentation. That's a big thing I use it for. Like who's trying to make like it's impossible to make sense of Microsoft documentation. It changes every day. AWS as well, right? So I use it all the time to say, hey, I'm trying to accomplish this goal in AWS. What's the best practice? And then of course it gives me an answer, and I'm like, okay, can I get a source to that so I can actually like verify that it's like a real documentation? So those are two kind of examples that as a defender, I'm using AI increasingly.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think from my point of view, AI has been there for like well over a decade now, powering detections for security. And that's still super important. And I think it often gets overlooked. So let's still highlight the fact that it's there. Probably the most interesting use case I've heard of for generative AI, we can talk about agents or assistants or whatever the current buzzword is. One of the best use cases I've seen for generative AI is kind of what you were talking about there, Jeffrey, but looking at detection logic. Like for so many organizations I go and speak to, they're like, we've got 400 detections. That's great, super, you've got good coverage. Except for, 50 of those detections were built by Bob, and Bob left 4 years ago. And we don't really know what they're doing anymore. So some cool things I've seen are actually, can we put those detections, those historic detections, through a language model to explain what they're doing and why they're doing it, so that we can then put that in our knowledge base, and actually it up levels the whole team, because you can start to say, well, actually those things that Bob built, they're amazing, except for that one, that's terrible. We need to bin it, that type of thing.
I want to address something pretty briefly at the beginning here. You made a really great comment, Greg, which is that AI comes in a lot of different flavors and a lot of different terms. Let's keep our conversation to generative AI, as I think it's the sort of the new complexity that's addressing these sorts of things. As you said quite accurately, AI has been around forever. It has been used by insurance organizations and financial organizations for risk generation and everything else, right, for a really long time. AI has sat at the core of endpoint detection tools for I don't know how long, right? There's been an AI tool sitting in those for a long time. So I want to kind of keep this to generative AI. So moving forward, when I say AI, I'm going to mean generative AI just for simplicity's sake. But Robert, you brought up a really interesting point. You made the comment that it's really challenging sometimes to get AI into established workflows. What do you guys think is going to have to change? Is it the AI tools interface, or are we going to have to evolve our workflows?
Wow, tough questions here today. It's a great question. I mean, like, because also, I mean, like, it is people. There's definitely a lot of like just this natural inertia of, hey, I have my way of working, and it's really great, and why would I change when I've already optimized it and perfected it? So there's, I would say, inertia. On the human side is definitely one of those things that is like slowing down that adoption of people taking it more directly into their workflows. Kind of really the best kind of work around that, I think, is Microsoft's approach with Copilot, where they are trying to embed it inside the tools that people use. So it's not that you have to switch context and go to your ChatGPT window and start asking a question. No, it's inside in the application, embedded inside the application. It's there, whether you want it or not. Like at the top of your Word document, you have that summarization now. Hey, this document is about this. So I think it's kind of Microsoft's approach is probably the way to like help kind of force that adoption. when it becomes kind of like just embedded as part of your human optimized workflow already, that it's all already there, just giving you suggestions. Hey, you could tweak this, or you could like add this. Like I do, that's how I'm starting now to use it a little bit more, even though, there's still some iffiness with Copilot, compared to ChatGPT, you know. Like some of the times it doesn't understand, when you're talking about the document, if you know what I mean, you're working on, or whether you want it to reach out to the world and like bring in some information. And sometimes it just like only thinks about internal documents. And so this mind reading ability of AI has got to still improve a little bit.
Yeah, I would fully agree that it's got to be within the existing workflows. Like we can't introduce yet another set of consoles. I think pretty much every security professional I speak to is fed up of having too many consoles already. But there's a balance here between expectation setting and reality. And for me, those in-console experiences are mostly incremental gains that I've seen today. So it's like, can we summarize that notable event for you? Can we help write a report for you? These aren't things that are life-changing for most people, but actually they do make a difference on that day-to-day. So the piece that I'm often left wondering is, how do we kind of get hold of that innovation and actually do something really amazing with it, but that keeps some kind of standardization? That's the trade-off for me, because it's non-deterministic. If you're talking about security, you can't have it recommending the wrong thing. That leaves us all in a lot of hot water. So innovation and standardization and balancing that in product, it's tough. I haven't seen anyone who's got it right yet.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really great point, Greg. Like a lot of times teams are kind of experimenting with this generative AI, sorry, internally, right? They're not bringing in some kind of expert consultant to kind of come in and show them. So they're experimenting with themselves. So kind of starting small, that policy of, or that standard of really crawl, walk, run, just try to have something simple, have it summarize the detection or notable, like you said, and then maybe you can have that kind of go into an existing flow. Maybe now, depending on the notable, maybe it alerts somebody depending on some kind of word or something like that. But like, I think a lot of times the pressure we get as defenders is like, hey, I just went to a conference and there's some agentic swarm I can put into my environment and it will do X, Y, and Z. Like you hear all these kind of buzzwords, and then the expectations from either leadership or just other people in the industry are like, you're behind. Why aren't you doing this? And I think that's a really interesting point, that we just need to kind of make those incremental gains, because every step you're not going to have some kind of external consultant. You want to make sure your own internal team has the skills to adapt, because once the consultant leaves or once the training's over, like they're going to be left to kind of make sure that stuff stays operational.
Interestingly enough, right? I think generative AI becomes an interface for our workflows, right? It is a way by which we interface with a lot of different elements within the organization. So there's this interesting question that I have regarding, like, at some point, the last tool that we had that dramatically changed the way we interfaced with a computer was the mouse, right? Microsoft solved the problem that people weren't familiar with mouses by adding solitaire to Windows. That was really the purpose of solitaire, was to convince people to use the mouse and to get comfortable with the processes, right? So I'm left wondering, what is the solitaire of AI, right? What is the tool that teaches people to use AI in a gamified fashion that's casual, right? It's interesting to see. I don't know that we have that. I will move on, unless somebody wants to comment on that bizarre thought.
No, I think it's really good. And like, for me, the bit that captured the imagination with ChatGPT was the simplicity, right? Transformers, the technology behind language models, have been around for the best part of a decade. No one was using them. Like, whereas as soon as they came along with that simple, it's just a search bar, you just ask a question, it looks and feels almost exactly like Google, which pretty much everyone on the planet is familiar with. That's the bit that got people to go, oh, AI isn't this scary thing where you have to be like a PhD and whatever to do. Anyone can do it. So I don't know if it needs the gamification. I think the bit that's missing from my perspective is personal productivity. Everyone's using it. Organizational productivity, there's something missing. And I don't know what that something is that kind of sparks that adoption, but that's the piece we need, whether it's a company-wide solitaire. I don't know, Aaron.
It's a good question though, right? There's clearly a disconnect between the workflow and the behavior, right? And it's really interesting to watch and sort of see everyone in the organizations deeply thinking about where is this break, right? What's the thing that's keeping this from happening? Let me move on with the sort of preset questions so the ones I've actually thought were important before I get deep into the whole of what is solitaire from a metaphorical perspective. Okay, so there's been a ton of talk about what you can do with AI and what people could do with AI. We already talked about the defenders. So I want to talk about the attackers a little bit. I have heard no limit to what attackers could do with AI, right? It's constantly being sought up. What are we actually seeing attackers do with AI? What do you guys really see from a realistic perspective that's happening day to day?
Well, maybe I can start. So definitely, kind of like unsurprisingly, I would say, it is the phishing is still by far the like most practical day-to-day place where we're seeing AI being used. I mean, gone are the days of like this really poorly spelled English Nigerian prince letters. Like they just don't exist anymore. Like they're definitely far more sophisticated. And even the selection of targets, I would say this is another place where like the bad guys are starting to like move further up the supply chain towards like them better targeting like the ordering, the finance department, the CFOs inside organizations. So those are the two places I would definitely call out that we're seeing, and like I remember back in the day of when COVID hit and having this like I was like crossing my fingers, maybe this is the time that email will die, and we'll all use Teams and we'll never have to think about all the email security issues again. I was like hoping, but no. Here we are, and just like last week, I saw the ENSA report, and still, the threat report for 2025, ENSA still called out phishing. 60% of all attacks come from phishing. Phishing is the vector, and so it's like, no, we're still stuck with it, and AI has only, I would say, ramped up phishing attacks, both in let's say the quality and the specificity of the attacks.
Yeah, that's definitely one of that kind of like resource development, a kind of initial access kind of stage of it, trying to get something. Another kind of avenue I see, I always call it like what the headline of the article says AI did maliciously versus like what actually, if you read the article, like what it actually says, it's like the first AI ransomware ever found. And then you actually kind of read it and it's like, no, the attacker just used some kind of like generative AI to like incorporate some code within the thing. And you can see like the lines from ChatGPT of like the comments. So I think there's a lot of like obviously fear mongering kind of going on, a lot of sensational claims like the AI swarm is like coming to a theater near you, something like that. But one example that I just wanted to call out was one actually from the CERT UA from Ukraine. Was that the Fancy Bear attack, APT, where they actually used a piece of malware called Lame Hug. And that was documented, and I'm reading here just because I am not going to sit here and lie to you that I'm some kind of expert, but it's being documented as the first known malware that integrates a large language model into a real-time command generation. So what that malware is doing is it's actually like kind of looking at the environment and then calling out to this kind of LLM saying, hey, give me a command to collect this data, to put all these files in one kind of zone. And I think that was really one of like the more concrete examples I would say of like, okay, no, they're actually using AI in a malicious way. Now, this was a very kind of like small stage attack. I haven't seen documentation of many of these, but it is happening. Like I would be remiss to sit here and say like, no, it's completely overblown. There is definitely stuff happening. But I think it's really important to, when you see those headlines, to really read those claims and understand how the AI is being used, because most times it's not as sophisticated as the journalist might want you to think.
That's really interesting, and I'm sure there'll be headlines about agentic malware in the not too distant future. I think like the few observations I have, just a couple of weeks ago, OpenAI released a report about how they're seeing malicious actors using their software, and surprise, surprise, it's just the same as the rest of us, right? They're mostly using it to turn themselves into knowledge workers, not to do anything new. There's very few new 0 days with them. So there was a lot of fear. We actually ran a report where we spoke to a bunch of our CISO customers around the globe back in 2023. And at that time, a vast majority of them responded saying AI is going to enable attackers more than defenders. I think it was around 70% thought that at the time. Then when we reran it in 2024, about 12 months later, it's completely balanced between attackers and defenders, because I think they all realized the day job hasn't changed. The bit I would caveat, and something that has been coming up more and more over the past 6 months, is that as more organizations have adopted their own AI, they're starting to realize there's a slightly different attack surface there. So slightly different points to secure, slightly different points to monitor, just additional things that we all have to do as security professionals. But it's not too different to anything else, right? It's still the same stuff, just different tech.
So let me bring this up, Greg. You're going directly into my next question. We've got
It's almost like we planned it, hey?
What's that?
It's almost like we planned it, hey?
Exactly. So one of the things that I think is sort of interesting is, for the most part, there has been a really comfortable balance between what the defenders and the attackers are doing with AI. It's really been dramatic, right? As much as everyone didn't think that was going to happen, and you highlight that beautifully. And I think it's really interesting to look at the fact that AI is a really unusual tool that has interfaces that we haven't quite seen before. So let's talk about, it's being used by both sides essentially to speed development, right? I mean, that's really what it's being used for, to simplify or to automate really simple manual tasks. But it also creates a whole new attack surface, like you said. But this is an attack surface, the likes of which we haven't seen before. And I don't think from a practical perspective, we really know what its borders are, right? I think it's got a very fuzzy border at the moment. So what do you guys see as sort of the theoretical, more interesting new attacks that we have yet to see, that are at the edge of creation?
Well, I would put, like, one of the things that like is interesting to me is try to think of the vulnerability platform is one something kind of like they run a vulnerability, they offer vulnerability management platform as a service effectively, where you can make responsible disclosures. Researchers can do responsible disclosures of 0 day or like vulnerabilities that they find inside a bit of software. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. It's one something. But anyway, the short version is now the #1 team on their platform is an AI. And so this AI is like finding all of these 0 day vulnerabilities and reporting them responsibly to the software vendors. And it does seem like a logical step. Okay, hey, this AI is very good at finding 0 day vulnerabilities. You know, the bad guys are. It's not going to take them long to make that connection of, okay, hey, should we start investing in like effectively open AI, like AI static analysis of code? Like, to give like, if I connect that to the recent F5 breach, for example, where now the attacker had like persistent long-term access to the core IP, to the source code of F5, you can imagine now connect those two things together. And I would imagine that there will be several zero-day vulnerabilities in the future targeting F5, because this is what like AI is going to be very good at. Is like, okay, hey, this is not just the code, but the context, the environment. Like these are how different attacks have been performed in the past. So I definitely think we're going to see more zero-day vulnerabilities when people get access to source code in particular.
Jeff, Greg, either one of you guys have interesting ideas on what the attacks are we have yet to really see?
So it's not my interesting idea. I can't lay any claim to this, but I was speaking to a higher education organization. In fact, it's academics about a year ago, and they were looking at things like, we've already spoken about phishing, and actually there's a really good set of filters. There's a really good way of identifying potential phishing that exists. Like that, to a certain extent, is a solvable problem. And what they were looking at was, actually, could you use generative AI to start to circumvent some of those controls by seeding in weird characters, but that are hidden to the human eye, so it still looks and reads like something you would expect. But to a like phishing email scanner, it would say, oh no, that's not in this list of obvious words, therefore we're going to let it pass through. I think, to me, that's an interesting bit of research. Whether it becomes reality or not, I don't know. Listening to what you were saying, Robert, I think there is something in that, which is, you've looked at a scenario where AI is being used for good. It's proactively finding and disseminating information about vulnerabilities for a positive reason. You could very easily take that same approach and not share that knowledge and use it to your benefit if you're a malicious actor. So I think things like that need to be watched, but it's not anything necessarily new. And then the final bit I would look at is the models themselves that sit under this thing are incredibly difficult to understand and interpret. And there are very few people who really understand how they work or why they produce the outputs. I think most of the big model development companies, OpenAIs, the Anthropics, and the Mistrals of this world, they've come out and they've said, we don't know why it's producing some of this stuff. And to me, if you're then embedding that into some kind of enterprise workflow, that's a new risk. And I don't think we fully understand the impact of that risk yet. It's maybe not the kind of exciting malicious actor, we're all fighting cybercrime, but I think that's something we need to look at carefully.
I think one of the things I want to highlight here is what we're sort of dancing around is the concept of model subversion, right? The concept that the model itself could be weaponized. And I think it's an interesting concept and an interesting vector because it leverages the fact that large organizations are teaching us to trust it, right? Large organizations are spending hundreds of millions of dollars to advertise and to convince you to trust the model. If the model can be manipulated, which there's fairly good evidence that models can be decently manipulated. And I don't think it's going to happen right away. This isn't a trivial thing that takes a short amount of time. But if we talk about things like the F5 attack, where someone was living off the land for a long time, there's a reasonable expectation that you could subvert a model with enough small introduction, right? It's an interesting threat. And I think it's one of those things that we have yet to have a real understanding of how you would combat it or even know that it's there. There is no indicator of compromise for it, right?
Yeah, I
Jeff?
think the other thing with like these enterprise kind of the integrations now, like Copilot's a good example. Like it can kind of, you're giving it access, right, to your entire repositories. Obviously, like there's siloing and segmentation from organization to organization, but like it's not infeasible to think that in a short while, or there could be a vulnerability within that kind of system, like let's say Copilot, for example, that you could like query payroll information for somebody like that. And because we're just relying on these kind of silos that, to your point, Greg, very few people understand in how the model works, one, and then two, how is Microsoft actually like segmenting all this data? So Jeffrey can't access Robert's kind of personal information that he's uploaded to kind of his own bot. So I think that's really interesting. One thing I think is a great resource as we talk about kind of feasibility and realized is MITRE Atlas. This is a new project, kind of if you're familiar with MITRE ATT&CK, it's kind of like a heat map, right? A different kind of matrix, if you will, where you can see kind of different techniques that threat actors use. And there's actually one for AI now. It's called Atlas. And there's actually a filter in the top right. If you just go to atlas.mitre.org, maybe we can link out to that, Emily, in the notes or in the chat or later on. But you can actually filter by maturity. Like what are these techniques are feasible, like they're possible, they're theoretical, versus what's actually documented. There's explicit knowledge that this is happening today, and I think that's really cool, and it will continue to grow. Like jailbreaking, right? Jailbreaking's all since the beginning of ChatGPT has been around, but then once you start kind of having more and more democratization of these models, then you start having these kind of dark models, dark GPT, worm GPT, where I think in a very short while it's going to be trivial to kind of, if you want to ask a very explicit question that could be very dangerous, there'll be models kind of on that fringe of the internet that you can easily kind of query with. You're not going to have to rely on some like 30 token kind of prompt to then get into that jailbreak. You can just go directly to the source, and that might even have less guardrails that you can develop MSIs, executables, etc. So just a couple of things that I think might be on the horizon.
Well, and I think as we look more at threat actors selling their capacity as a service, right, this sort of thing becomes more and more viable and more frequent, right? I think one of the things that evolved in the last 10 years was the notion of threat actors as a service. Um, and it's a really interesting to see how much that business model has changed and grown. I hate to call it a business model because it sort of implies a level of legitimacy, but it's functionally what it is, right? It's interesting to see. So let's talk about, we talked about like threats and offense and defense and all the sort of theoretical. So let's talk about the real practical stuff. What are the controls that are becoming the things that people can't live without when they're bringing generative AI into their organization? What are the barriers that they're putting around it? Robert, you want to start?
Yeah, so definitely it's a challenge, and I guess an opportunity then for some new startups to start selling their AI-empowered applications. So definitely, buyer beware here as well. I would say to a very large degree, like AI doesn't really change the risk. Like the risk has always been there, and like this is still an information security problem, and if you don't have good information security controls already in place, you're going to have a bad day, So like, yes, AI may speed up that day and bring that day a little bit forward, but fundamentally, you need to have good governance, you need to have compliance, you need to have this like holistic vision. I would definitely suggest ISO certifications, is a good place to start developing your maturity. Of course, DLP, it's actually a little dangerous to talk about tools. Hey, when we're saying tools, buy this tool because it'll protect you from this other tool, it's kind of this self-fulfilling prophecy to a degree. So I would be a little bit, even though I'm a tech guy, I would say this isn't always a technical problem, and this can be, more of a governance problem, a compliance problem, rather than a purely technical. And if people rush out to buy a new technology, no matter how shiny and like awesome the demo may be, they may still end up with a bad time.
Yeah, and I think it's really important just to it sounds like simple, and in this day and age where everyone wants the latest and greatest kind of AI tool, whether it be Cursor or whatever the newest one is out there, is just to kind of take that strategic pause for your organization to kind of understand what's permitted, what's not. And you kind of have to think of it from a threat model capability of like, okay, how, if our developers or if our finance team uses this specific application, what could be the risks? How can we kind of subvert that? Is it buying some kind of enterprise license? Is it tweaking the settings? Is it just communication with those people that are using it, making sure they understand the risks, sign some kind of declaration? It just depends on your organization. But I think a lot of times it's just like go, go, go. But it's really hard to kind of like, we say like put the toothpaste back in the capsule, or I actually don't know that expression anymore. But you know what I mean? It's really hard once it's out there and once people are already using it and kind of making sure it's integrated into their current processes. It's really hard to kind of say, okay, actually, let's take a 90-day pause on that, and so we can review it. Then the business doesn't want to do that. So you kind of have to move at the speed of what the technology develops. And unfortunately, that's very chaotic, but I find it's really the best way to get a handle on it.
Yeah, it always just comes back to people, doesn't it? I think the one thing we haven't spoken about so far in terms of Defender's biggest headache is internal people doing stupid things. And I think that's never been a bigger issue than with AI. So maybe just looking a bit about what we've done internally, particularly through the Cisco acquisition. I've seen two approaches, and I think they're fairly common with many other organizations that I've spoken to. The Cisco approach is you have a set of standard tools, and that's all you get. If you use anything else, that's out of policy, and it becomes quite, I wouldn't say draconian, actually. Cisco is quite a nice company, but it's like use it or lose it, basically. And it all goes through committee, it all gets assured centrally, and there are policies in place. But prior to the acquisition, though, at Splunk, we had a bit more of an open-ended process where we had a steering committee. But instead of that steering committee just purely being security, like they were a big stakeholder, our CISO was part of that steering committee. We also incorporated in product and engineering, our head of AI, and some pretty senior folks from go-to-market as well, so that we could have that balanced conversation around if we introduce this tool, or if we allow our staff to do this thing, what does it give us versus what's the risk, rather than just a purely risk-based approach. And then when it comes to controls, I've seen a whole wide spectrum out there. I think the most common one is just spot checks, like looking at firewall logs to see actually who's gone and browsed to ChatGPT. Can we just do some spot checks and start instilling the fear of God into everyone that you're going to get checked and you're going to get asked difficult questions? All the way through to, there's now an open source project. If you've come across Open Telemetry, there is now Open LLMetry, and that actually allows you to introspect into the actual prompts and responses themselves. So you can do things with a bit more bigger, but most are more towards that kind of spot check and audit placed and having proper technology-based solutions out there.
Great answers. So one of the questions that I've got, when we talk about controls and we talk about organizations bringing AI into their organization, what we're really talking about is investment, right? We're talking about significant spending. There is a pretty concerning MIT report that is one of my favorites. I love MIT's analysis of these sorts of things. They did a wonderful job. They said 95% of enterprise Gen AI projects are not going to show a measurable return of investment, right? Despite how much money is being spent on them. So the question becomes, for everybody listening, what do we do not to be a part of that 95%? What can you actually do to make sure that this is a real benefit to your org and not just an expensive experiment?
Yeah, in the beginning, when I was saying that kind of crawl, walk, run, I've also read that study. I actually read it on like the beach on Labor Day, and my girlfriend's not technical, but I was explaining to her like how like this is going to like change everything, like this study, and I really think it has been a topic of conversation in multiple forums I've been a part of. And I think it just goes to show like it's so important that if you choose to kind of incorporate AI into one of your workflows, a current workflow, you have to make sure it's like possible. And and I think that really starts with having the right people with the technical prowess to understand, okay, what we're trying to do, is it even possible to use AI in this capacity? Or like if you start an impossible project, you shouldn't be surprised if the end result is impossible. So I think it's really about starting small and trying to kind of look at the team you have and what can you actually accomplish. Because a lot of the times the return you can get from AI, like it's a return, right? And I think the MIT study even said that a lot of times it was kind of those back end processes. It's not the awesome like Salesforce integration that speeds up the marketing team's email click rate by 1,000,000%. It's like that back end HR process that was super rudimentary, but was still manual, right? And that's where you can kind of have those wins. So I think a lot of times, and we've kind of harped on this, that the business expects the win to kind of be super visible, but a lot of times it's really kind of farther back where you kind of free up those teams, those knowledge workers to then take on the next problem. And then maybe that next problem, it can be a little bit of AI into it. And we're just going to start incorporating a little bit more that crawl, walk, run approach.
I would fully agree with that, Jeffrey. And I think, now we said we wouldn't talk about traditional machine learning, but it's the same problem I've seen over the past 2 decades, which is poorly defined objectives, poor outcome, which I think is exactly what you were just saying there. There are kind of 2 scenarios, and weirdly, neither of them involved well-defined objectives. But for organizations I've worked with who've actually deployed AI, which are rare, it's usually come from 2 sources. One is board pressure, and then it has just been sheer luck that they happen to get something out the door. The second is having a little skunk works team. And often that's just a bunch of like interns, super smart interns doing some really interesting projects. But the ones that have worked, those projects were connected with the business and trying to solve a tangible problem rather than just, hey, should we do some stuff with AI? So I think defining those objectives, understanding when it's right and when it's not right is critical. The other thing is you have to understand that it is a bit of a research project. Like I've run engineering teams and I've run data science teams in the past. And with an engineering team, you go around a development cycle and you either fix a bug, you ship a new feature, you make some kind of improvement at the end of that cycle. It's not always the case with a data science team. You might go around that cycle and end up with a model or a technique that is worse than what you started with. And I think that's something you need to accept and have processes for and make sure the business understands as well. Otherwise, you're just going to end up going, hey, we tried it, it failed, we're giving up, moving on to the next one. But you tried and failed with that model. Why don't we try this one or this particular RAG architecture and maybe we'll get what we want. So you've got to be able to trial and error safely, I think is what I'm trying to say in short.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with both Greg and Jeff on that. You know, like I definitely see that like people have this overconfidence. You know, they interact with ChatGPT or Anthropic or whatever AI, and they think it's fantastic. Oh, this is great! Like this personal productivity, and they think, okay, I'm experienced at that, so thus anything I do for the organization side is just going to be just as successful. And I think kind of what the guys are saying is like forget about that, like, especially if you don't have a very large R&D organization, go small, like pick a problem that has a very clearly defined scope and like then make that scope even smaller, and do what is the smallest thing that you can do with AI that will show some value to the business, because as you said, this requires a lot of investment and you don't want to just screw up this but all future potential projects, so you want to make sure that the first thing that you do is successful. And so I would say like pick a problem, that's really small, get that working. Ideally buy something, as much as I would love, as much as I love building technology, like people have solved some of these problems already. Go just buy that tool, buy that technology. So many of these things now are SaaS. And if a company tries to build their own version of this and God forbid, start building their own model themselves, like you're just going to have a bad time, so just don't do that.
I really like the focus that every one of you had on find an actual problem that can be solved and that can be solved with this tool. It's a thing that gets missed almost every time, to be perfectly honest. One of the things that I think really fascinated me was with the rise of talk about agentic AI is how ambiguous the problems that agentic AI is sort of designed to solve really are. And I think that's kind of fascinating. It actually thrives in scenarios where there aren't really clear guardrails, right? I mean, all the guys who really know what they're talking about from the agentic AI space, their conversation is, look, when you've got manual stuff that needs to be done over and over and over again, go solve that with a normal automation system, right? Don't solve that with agentic AI. When you've got something really complex and weird that reaches across multiple parts of the org, has poorly defined barriers, that's actually the place to target agentic AI. And I think it's very contrary to, before those conversations became big, it's very contrary to where I thought that would go. Right? I really expected it to be the exact opposite. So I'm really fascinated to see sort of where that goes. I have yet to see a really beautiful demonstration of it working the way I would like it to, right? Of course, I think we're all sort of there, but I'd like to see where that goes in the future. So I'm going to ask us sort of a last question. I'm going to ask you guys probably the hardest question, and it's one that I think is significant from a governance and a sort of human perspective around AI, which is when AI makes a wrong decision, which it is false to say that AI makes a decision anyway. But when AI provides someone with wrong input, right? Um, who should be held accountable? Is this a developer, an organization, or the algorithm itself, right? Who in your feelings, sort of from a regulatory perspective, maybe, where does that responsibility lie? I'm going to throw this to Jeff first.
Yeah, I'm gonna try very hard to not sit on the fence for this, but I would say it really depends how much kind of autonomy that AI is given in that scenario. If the company is trusting AI enough to, let's say, quarantine a host, if it thinks there's a high enough degree of confidence, then I think it's on the people that kind of develop that workflow to bear the burden of that. You're saying, hey, I am trusting this kind of decision process to analyze all of the different fields and say, yes, okay, this host should be quarantined. And then if it makes the wrong decision, I would look squarely at the person who designed this workflow that gave this kind of power to quarantine a host. And I would say, okay, what kind of testing was done? Is it a 1% fail rate and we've had 99 successes? Like, I think context would be really important there. But I'm not one who thinks that, like, just because it is like AI, it's just going to be the oh, it's no one's fault. Like, someone, I think we all know someone always is going to have to get blamed for something. There has to be accountability. That's kind of how businesses work. And yeah, I think it really just depends on the context. And like I said, if it is like a 99% uptime, then that's better than any human would be. So let's not hold AI to a higher standard than we would hold a human, right? Like, we all make mistakes. However, like, what degree of mistakes are being made?
Yeah, I think ultimately it's going to end up being the organization that implements it that gets held accountable, rightly or wrongly. And I think precedent has already been set there. I think it was like Canada Airways last year, whose chatbot provided incorrect advice and they were found liable. So there's a precedent already. What I do think that means, though, is that we're going to end up with some very interesting questions coming up during procurement cycles of vendors and suppliers around how they've done that assurance, a lot of the things that Jeffrey was just talking about. So like, one of the things we've kicked about internally is, should we seed in an element of randomness into some of our products, so that instead of everything always being automated and always being actioned by the AI, should we occasionally just escalate some stuff to an analyst to avoid that mindset of complete and utter trust ocean to your AI buddy? But I think we're going to see a lot more scrutiny there. But really, from my perspective, accountability lies with whoever implements it. You can't blame the AI. It's just a tool. It'd be like me saying, oh, it was the firewall's fault. Well, who configured the firewall, right? Someone did it.
Yeah, I would fully agree. You know, like if you buy a chainsaw, you know, whose responsibility is it when things go bad? You know, like you have that responsibility to get trained and be trained. This can be a potentially very valuable tool, or you can do horrific things to yourself with it. You know, and so you know that company, the organization, I would say the especially in the EU that there's a very clear like stance taken by the EU on this that like NIS2 and EU AI Act, there's no ambiguity whatsoever. Like responsibility lies with the board. You know, now it is now a board level topic, so the organization ultimately is responsible.
So this is an interesting place where I think we're seeing an interesting split occur. So there's some great examples where the board has been held responsible, but let's take a look at, say, Tesla self-driving for a form of AI that the developers being held responsible for whether or not it becomes a matter of false advertising, right? I think at one point, one of the things we're probably going to have to see is either consumer pressure that increases the reliability of AI, or it's going to be regulation, right? At some point, there's going to be something that pushes it. I think, Jeff, you brought up a fantastic point about how we hold AI to a higher standard than we do the humans. And it's a really funny conversation, right? Because we're so used to machines having deterministic outputs, right? We are so used to the notion that a machine will always give you one if you give it one, right? It always behaves in the exact same way. And the fact that it doesn't has created this really strange space where we try to figure this out. I think it's an interesting conversation about where that's going. Um, I hope that we will see more regulation around the development simply because we have plenty of tools. You brought up the chainsaw. I would argue that it's not a chainsaw. I would argue it's a car, right? And there's tons of regulation about what a car has to do to be considered safe and marketable. Will there be a point where we say, I'm sorry, your AI has to meet a certain degree of correctness or safety before it becomes marketable? And even trying to define those barriers would be incredibly hard, right? But I think that's the sort of space that, from the space when we consider ourselves sort of a mature society handling it, maybe that's where we need to be. That's an interesting conversation. What do you guys think?
I think it really depends on the use case and the industry. Like bringing up the Tesla example is perfect, but Tesla's cars, they're designed to do specific things under specific circumstances. Whereas I think what we're seeing with AI is a general purpose technology that is being used in multiple ways across multiple industries to do a wide variety of weird and wonderful things. And I think without that context, you can't really clearly define what safety looks. And I think that was one of the things that actually the EU really struggled with the AI Act. So they ended up just honing in on a set of industries and a set of use cases that needed better control. So I don't know if something similar will happen. Maybe cybersecurity ends up being the thing that gets more scrutiny when it comes to AI use. I doubt it, because then we have that trade-off with the attackers having free reign to do what they like. It's a difficult place to be, and I'm glad I'm not a policy writer or regulator. That's all I'm going to say.
That's a great answer. So I've got to wrap this up a little bit, guys. I want to bring up a couple of things before we end. First of all, I want to thank you all because there's some really complicated questions here. And this is a really sophisticated topic that, to be perfectly honest, a lot of people refuse to sit down and discuss publicly, right? Because it's challenging. It's incredibly hard. There are not great answers to a lot of these questions, right? And I think that leads a lot of panelists to be very cautious. So I really appreciate it. And Jeff, the comment, I'm not going to sit on the fence in this. I want to make a decisive comment. I appreciate that, right? I think it's important. I think it's important for folks to really lean into their expertise and show where it comes through, right? I want to bring up the fact that our flagship event, Zero Day Con, is about to happen next year in April. It's on the 29th. If you register, if you attend any of the Smart Tech 247 events through October, which is, of course, Cybersecurity Awareness Month, you will be entered into a drawing to win a free ticket to Zero Day Con. It's going to be an absolutely phenomenal event. Please take a look at it on the website. If you guys have not seen Zero Day Con before, there are a lot of really fascinating panelists who have really unique interactions around the cyberspace. Do take a look. It's well worth your time. Thank you guys very much for today. I really appreciate the conversation. Hope we get to do it again soon.